There is something in you that has never been touched, not by the hardest years, not by the losses you still carry, not by the relationships that ended badly, the opportunities that never came, the versions of yourself that you tried to be and couldn't sustain, not by any of it. This is not a consolation. It is not a spiritual metaphor designed to make suffering more bearable. It is not the kind of thing that spiritual teachers say to comfort people who are hurting. It is a precise, rigorously investigated, cross-culturally verified description of something that every major wisdom tradition on earth has examined directly and arrived at the same conclusion about. There is a dimension of what you are that experience cannot damage. The hermetic tradition, one of the oldest and most sophisticated philosophical lineages in Western history, called it the divine spark, the fragment of the infinite that is present in every human being, prior to all experience, unaffected by all experience, incapable of being diminished by anything that happens in time. The Egyptian mystery schools called it the Akh, the immortal, luminous aspect of the soul that the initiation process was designed to reveal, not to create, not to develop, to reveal, because it was always already there. The Vedic tradition of ancient India called it Atman, the deepest self, described in the Upanishads as unborn, undying, unchanging. Not something you acquire through spiritual practice, something you recognize as what you have always been. The Sufi mystics called it al-sir, the innermost secret, the point in the human being that is not separate from the divine reality itself. The Christian mystical tradition called it the ground of the soul, what Meister Eckhart described as the place in you that was never born and will never die. Different names, different centuries, different civilizations that never communicated with each other. The same recognition. Tonight, we recover what every tradition has always known about the part of you that has never been hurt. To understand what the ancient traditions were pointing toward, we need to begin with the distinction that modern culture has almost completely lost. The distinction between the self that experiences and the awareness that is present while the experiencing is happening. In ordinary life, these two things are almost always conflated. The experiences you have, the emotions, the memories, the thoughts, the sensations, the story of your life as it has unfolded, seem to be identical with what you are. You are your experiences. You are your history. You are the accumulated content of a particular human life. This seems so obvious that questioning it feels almost absurd. And yet, every genuine contemplative tradition in human history has made precisely this distinction. And every tradition has arrived at the same finding. The awareness in which experience occurs is not the same as the experience. And the awareness, unlike the experience, cannot be damaged. Let us examine what this means carefully, because it is easy to hear this and misunderstand it in a way that makes it seem irrelevant to actual human suffering. The ancient traditions are not saying that suffering is not real. They are not saying that loss does not hurt, that grief is an illusion, that the wounds of a human life do not matter. The wounds matter. The grief is real. The suffering is genuine. What the traditions are saying is something more specific and more interesting than a denial of suffering. They are saying that the one who suffers, the awareness that is present through the suffering, is not itself wounded by what it witnesses. Here is an analogy that points toward this. though like all analogies, it is imperfect. A mirror reflects everything that appears before it: darkness, light, beauty, ugliness, joy, grief. Every image appears in the mirror with complete fidelity. The mirror does not choose what to reflect. It does not resist or cling. And yet the mirror itself is not stained by any of it. The darkness that appears in a mirror does not make the mirror dark. The image of a wound in a mirror does not wound the mirror. The mirror remains unchanged through everything it reflects. The awareness that the ancient traditions were pointing toward, the Ak, the Atman, the divine spark, the ground of the soul, functions something like this. Not as a metaphor for detachment, not as a philosophical position that allows you to pretend that suffering does not matter, but as a description of what is actually present beneath the suffering, as the ground within which all experience, including the most painful experience, arises. This is what the hermetic tradition called the nous, the divine intelligence that is the deepest nature of the human being. And it is worth looking carefully at what the hermetic tradition actually said about it. The hermetic tradition is one of the most ancient and most misunderstood philosophical lineages in the Western world. Its foundational texts, the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of philosophical dialogues attributed to the legendary sage Hermes Trismegistus, were composed in the first few centuries of the Common Era, though they claim to transmit a wisdom tradition of far greater antiquity, tracing its origins to the Egyptian god Thoth. For centuries, the Hermetic texts were suppressed, lost, or known only in fragments. When Marsilio Ficino translated the complete Corpus Hermeticum into Latin in 1463, at the request of Cosimo de' Medici, who had just received the manuscripts from a Byzantine monk, the effect on Renaissance European thought was immediate and profound. But what the Hermetic tradition actually says, at its deepest level, beneath the elaborate cosmological systems and symbolic language, is something that has been consistent across its entire history. The universe is structured according to the principle of correspondence. As above, so below. As within, so without. The patterns that appear at the largest scale of reality appear at the smallest. The macrocosm and the microcosm are reflections of each other. And at the center of this correspondence, at the point where the largest and the smallest meet, is the human being. Not as an accident of evolution, not as a biological organism that happened to develop consciousness as a byproduct of neural complexity, but as the point at which the divine intelligence that underlies all of reality becomes aware of itself. The Hermetic texts describe the human being as containing a spark of the divine nous, the infinite self-aware intelligence that is the ground of all existence. This spark is not a metaphor. It is understood as a literal fragment of the divine reality, present in every human being, constituting the deepest layer of their nature. And the crucial claim of the Hermetic tradition, the claim that connects it directly to what we are exploring tonight, is that this divine spark cannot be affected by anything that happens in the phenomenal world. The nous is beyond time, beyond change, beyond the cycle of birth and death and everything that happens between them. The experiences of a human life, however intense, however transformative, however apparently destructive, occur within the field of time. They are temporal phenomena. The divine spark at the center of the human being is not temporal. It does not age. It does not accumulate wounds. It does not carry the weight of history. It is, as the hermetic tradition puts it, always already pure. Not because it has been purified, but because purity is its nature. Not something it achieves, something it is. This is what the mystery schools of Alexandria were teaching when they were destroyed. This is what Newton was approaching when he studied the hermetic manuscripts in secret. This is what every genuine wisdom tradition has been saying, in different languages and different symbolic systems, for as long as human beings have been asking the deepest questions about the nature of what they are. The Vedic tradition of ancient India arrived at the same recognition through a completely different method. Where the Hermetic tradition approached this understanding through cosmological speculation and symbolic philosophy, the Vedic tradition approached it through systematic first-person inquiry, through the direct examination of the nature of experience from the inside. The method is described in the Upanishads as neti-neti. Not this, not this. It works like this. You begin with the most obvious candidate for what you are, the body. Are you the body? You can observe the body. You can feel sensations in it, witness it changing, notice it aging. But the one who is observing the body, the awareness that is noticing all of this, is not the body. It is prior to the body. It does not depend on the body to be aware. So, not this. Are you the thoughts? You can observe thoughts arising and dissolving. You can notice when you are thinking and when you are not. The awareness that observes the thoughts is prior to the thoughts. Not this. Are you the emotions? You can witness emotions arising and passing. Grief arises and grief passes. Joy arises and joy passes. The awareness that witnesses them does not arise and pass with them. Not this. Are you the memories, the accumulated story of your life? You can remember and you can forget, and the one who is doing the remembering is not the content of the memories. Not this. What remains when everything that can be observed has been set aside? The observer, the awareness itself, what the Vedic tradition calls the witness, the sakshi, or, at the most fundamental level, the Atman. And here is the crucial finding of the Upanishadic investigation. The finding that connects it directly to what we have been exploring tonight. The Atman is described in the Upanishads as Nitya, eternal, unchanging, without beginning and without end, not because it has survived a long time, not because it has been protected from damage, but because it is, by its nature, outside of time. It is the ground within which time arises, not something that exists within time, and something that is outside of time cannot be wounded by events that occur within time. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad states, the Atman cannot be cut by weapons, burned by fire, moistened by water, or dried by wind. This is not poetry about resilience. It is a precise philosophical claim about the nature of the deepest dimension of what you are. It cannot be wounded by experience, not because it is protected from experience, but because it is the ground within which experience occurs. And the ground is not affected by what arises within it. The ocean is not wet by the waves. Now let us bring this recognition into contact with what it means for an actual human life. Because it is possible and quite common to understand these ideas intellectually and miss their practical significance entirely. The Hermetic divine spark and the Vedic Atman are not interesting philosophical positions to be added to your collection of sophisticated ideas about the nature of reality. They are descriptions of something that is present right now in the actual texture of your actual experience, that you may never have noticed because you have never been shown where to look. Here is what they are pointing at. In this moment, as you receive these words, there is awareness, not awareness of anything in particular, just the simple, undeniable fact of being aware, of there being experience at all, of there being something rather than nothing happening in your consciousness. That awareness, the bare fact of it, prior to any particular content, is what the ancient traditions were pointing toward, not a special state, not a meditative achievement, not something that requires years of practice to access. The most immediate, most present, most undeniable fact of your existence. And here is what the traditions are saying about it. That awareness has never been wounded, not by the hardest years, not by the relationship that broke you, not by the loss you have not yet recovered from, not by the version of yourself that you are most ashamed of, not by any of it, because the awareness that was present through all of those experiences, that witnessed them, that knew them, that was there as they happened, was not the same as the content of the experiences. The grief was in the awareness. The grief was not the awareness. The wound appeared in the awareness. The wound was not the awareness. The awareness was present before the grief and will be present after it. It was present before the wound and has remained present since. This is what the Sufi tradition calls the secret, al-sir, the innermost reality that no external circumstance can reach. Not because it is hidden or protected, but because it is not in the domain where external circumstances operate. And the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, writing in medieval Germany with no direct access to the Vedic or hermetic texts, described exactly this when he spoke of the ground of the soul. He said, "There is something in the soul that is above the soul, divine, simple, and absolute nothing, rather nameless than named, rather unknown than known. God pours himself into this ground, and in this ground he penetrates the soul, above the soul, not inside the ordinary personal self, but deeper than it, not damaged by what happens to the ordinary personal self, because it is not the ordinary personal self. The same recognition, a different century, a different language, a different tradition, the same truth." At this point, something important needs to be said about what this recognition does and does not mean for how you relate to your own suffering. Because it is possible to misuse this understanding in a way that makes it harmful rather than liberating. The misuse goes like this: if the deepest part of me has never been hurt, then the parts of me that have been hurt don't really matter. The grief is not real. The wound is an illusion. I should be able to simply recognize the Atman and be done with suffering. This is not what the ancient traditions teach, and it is not what the recognition actually produces in those who genuinely arrive at it. The genuine recognition of the unwounded ground of awareness does not produce detachment from human experience. It does not make suffering seem unreal or unimportant. It does not allow you to bypass the actual work of grieving, healing, and integrating the experiences of a human life. What it produces is something more subtle and more valuable than any of those things. It produces a different relationship with suffering, not suffering without ground, not suffering that has no bottom, that falls endlessly through a void of meaninglessness with nothing to hold it, but suffering that arises within a ground that is stable, that is not itself threatened by the suffering, that can hold the full weight of the most difficult human experience without being destroyed by it. The Tibetan tradition has a practice called sitting with, the deliberate, sustained practice of remaining present with whatever is arising in experience without either suppressing it or being swept away by it, resting in the awareness that is present through the experience rather than identifying completely with the experience itself. This is not the same as not feeling. It is not the same as emotional detachment. It is the practice of recognizing in the midst of genuine feeling that the one who feels is not destroyed by what is felt. And this practice, which the Tibetan tradition has refined over centuries, and which every genuine contemplative tradition has its own version of, becomes possible when you have some recognition, however partial, of what the ancient traditions were pointing toward. The unwounded ground, the Ak, the Atman, the divine spark, the ground of the soul, the part of you that has never been hurt, not because your life has been painless, but because what you most fundamentally are is prior to pain. If you have followed this conversation from the hermetic divine spark to the Vedic Atman, from the Sufi al-Sira to Meister Eckhart's ground of the soul, from the neti investigation of the Upanishads to the Tibetan practice of sitting with, then something has been laid out before you that is worth pausing to acknowledge. You have been shown a map, not a map of somewhere else, not a map of a spiritual state, to be achieved in some future lifetime of sufficient practice. A map of what is present right now. The awareness that has been receiving these words, that has been here through every moment of this conversation and through every moment of your life before this one, is the territory the map is describing. And the map says this, that awareness has never been wounded. However many times you have been hurt, however many losses you have carried, however many years you have spent in the grip of grief or shame or fear or confusion. The awareness that was present through all of it, witnessing all of it, knowing all of it, was never damaged by any of it. This is not a claim that requires faith. It is an invitation to look, not at the content of your experience, at the memories, the emotions, the stories, the wounds, but at what is present before the content, beneath the content, as the ground within which all the content arises, the simple, clear, undeniable fact of being aware. Right now, in this moment, that is what Hermes Trismegistus called the nous, what the Vedic sages called the Atman, what the Sufi masters called al-Sir, what Meister Eckhart called the ground of the soul. And it is not something you need to find. It is what is already present as the one who is looking. At Sacred Flame, this is the recognition we exist to support, not as a belief to be adopted, not as a spiritual achievement to be worked toward, but as a direct investigation available right now in the actual texture of your actual experience, of what every ancient tradition agreed is the most important thing a human being can discover about themselves. Subscribe if this work matters to you. Share this with someone who has been carrying the weight of their history as if it were the whole of what they are. It is not. And the part of them that has never been hurt is right where it has always been. We began tonight by saying that there is something in you that has never been touched. not by the hardest years, not by the losses you still carry, not by any of the experiences that have shaped the person you experience yourself to be. And we followed that claim through 4 of the most sophisticated philosophical traditions in human history. The hermetic tradition called it the divine spark, the fragment of the infinite nous that is present in every human being, constituting the deepest layer of their nature, incapable of being diminished by anything that occurs in time. The Vedic tradition called it the Atman, the witness, the deepest self, described in the Upanishads as unborn, undying, and outside of time, the ground within which all experience arises, unaffected by the content of what arises. The Sufi tradition called it al-Sir, the innermost secret, the point in the human being that is not separate from the divine reality itself. The Christian mystical tradition called it the ground of the soul, the place in you that, as Meister Eckhart wrote, was never born and will never die. And what all of these traditions agreed on, the single recognition at the center of all of them, is this: you are not only the person who has been hurt, you are also, and more fundamentally, the awareness in which the hurting happened, and that awareness has never been wounded. This distinction is not a philosophical abstraction. It is not a consoling metaphor. It is the most practically significant distinction available to a human being, because it changes the ground from which you meet every subsequent experience of your life. Meeting life from the contracted stance of the wounded self, always defending its wounds, always managing its vulnerability, always interpreting new experience through the lens of old damage, produces a particular quality of life, one that most people recognize from the inside without knowing its name. Meeting life from the open, stable ground of the awareness that has never been wounded, even partially, even intermittently, even in brief moments of genuine stillness, produces something different. Not a life without difficulty, not an end to grief or loss or the ordinary pain of being human, but a different relationship with all of it. A relationship in which the difficulty is met with a stability that the difficulty cannot reach. Because the stability is not a psychological achievement, not a coping mechanism, not a mental attitude that can be undermined by sufficiently extreme circumstances. It is the nature of what you actually are. The ancient traditions spent thousands of years developing maps and methods and transmission lineages to make this recognition accessible to human beings who were ready to receive it. Those maps are still available. The territory they describe is still present, right here, right now. As the awareness reading these words, the part of you that has never been hurt has been here the entire time. You were just looking in the wrong direction. Until next time, stay awake.